Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to admit, I hesitated a little bit before hitting record on this one. Usually we're talking about history or tech, and it's all very, safe. But today we are opening a file that feels a little bit like walking into a minefield.
It is certainly one of the more provocative texts we've covered.
Provocative is a polite way to put it. We tend to think of the New Testament as this unified, harmonious anthology. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, and Paul, they're the band. They might play different instruments, but they're all playing the same song.
They're all on the same team. That's the traditional narrative, yes. The assumption is that they're all building the same theology, just from different angles.
Right. But what if they aren't? What if I told you that, according to the source material we have today, specifically a chapter from the Stolen Messiah series, the band broke up a long time ago? And not only that, but they are actively fighting in the liner notes.
It's a vivid image. The source argues that if you look closely at the text forensically, you see that the Gospels, Peter, and Revelation aren't just different from Paul. They're essentially subtweeting him.
Subtweeting him.
They're tearing his arguments to shreds.
Subtweeting the Apostle Paul. Okay, so the premise here is that there's a civil war happening in the New Testament.
A civil war between the teachings of Yeshua Jesus and the theology of Paul. And the author's claim is that Paul wasn't building on Yeshua's foundation. He was hijacking it.
Hijacking. So that's where I get stuck. Because I grew up hearing that Paul is the architect. He's the guy who took Jesus's local message and, explained it to the world. He universalized it. So calling him a hijacker, isn't that a bit of a conspiracy theory?
It sounds like one at first glance. But the source frames it with a very modern analogy to explain the mechanics of what's happening. They compare Paul to a black hat hacker.
A hack.
Think about it. A software engineer builds a system. Then a hacker comes along. The hacker doesn't build on the code to make it run better as designed. He breaks into it to make it do something the original engineer never intended.
Okay, I see.
The source argues Paul is the hacker, and Yeshua's teachings are the original operating system.
Okay, so if Paul is the hacker, what is the original software? What did he break?
The oral law. And this is where we have to do some heavy lifting, because oral law usually sounds, like boring tradition to modern ears.
Yeah, when I hear oral law, I think of the Pharisees. And usually when we talk about Pharisees, they're the bad guys. They're the rigid, legalistic rule followers that Jesus was always yelling at.
That is the caricature we're used to. But the source flips this upside down. The argument here is that Yeshua was a Pharisee.
Wait, hold on. Yeshua was a Pharisee, the guy who flipped the tables?
Yes. The source argues he was operating within the Pharisaic system, not trying to destroy it. You have to understand the legal landscape of the first century. You had the written Torah, the books of Moses, but then you had the oral tradition, which were the rulings of the rabbis on how to actually do the law.
So like case law.
Exactly like case law or Supreme Court rulings. The Constitution says freedom of speech, but the Supreme Court tells you if that applies to shouting fire in a crowded theater,
Yeah.
that's the oral law.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the source points out that many of the things Yeshua does only make sense if he accepts the authority of that system.
I need an example, because I always picture him breaking the rules, not following Supreme Court precedent.
Okay, let's look at the famous story of the man born blind in John chapter 9. Yeshua heals him on the Sabbath. How does he do it?
He spits on the ground, makes mud, puts it on the guy's eyes.
Right. And the Pharisees get upset because he worked on the Sabbath. Now look at the details. The written Torah says don't work. It doesn't give a list of specific actions. But the oral law, specifically the rabbinic enactments, defined kneading dough as work. And by making mud, Yeshua was technically kneading.
So they got him on a technicality.
They got him on a specific point of oral law. Now here is the crucial part. If Yeshua was anti-law, if he was an anarchist who rejected all tradition, he would have simply said, show me in the Bible where it says I can't make mud.
Right, it's not in the text, so get off my back.
But he doesn't do that. Instead, he defends himself using a legal principle called Hora'at Shah.
Horat Shah, what does that mean?
It means a ruling of the hour. It's a specific emergency clause in Jewish law. It allows a prophet to temporarily violate a specific command for a greater divine purpose.
So like an emergency override?
Think of it like a speeding ticket. If you get pulled over for doing 90 in a 50 zone, you have two ways to argue. Option A, you scream, speed limits are tyranny, I don't recognize your authority.
That's the anarchist approach, the Paul approach, maybe.
According to this source, yes. But option B is, officer, I know the speed limit is 50 and I respect that, but my wife is in labor in the back seat.
That's the ruling of the hour.
Correct. And by using that excuse, what are you admitting?
I'm admitting that the speed limit is valid. I'm just saying I have a special reason to break it this one time.
Boom. That is the source's point. By arguing Horat Shah, Yeshua is validating the authority of the oral law. He is saying, I am a prophet operating under an emergency clause, not your system is broken. He is arguing case law.
That is a subtle but massive difference. So when he's fighting with the Pharisees, it's not God versus legalism. It's, what, two lawyers arguing over a statute?
It's what's called makluket shem shamayim, a conflict for the sake of heaven. The source brings up another example in Mark 7. The Pharisees were letting people starve their parents because their money was dedicated to God.
Oh, yeah, the Corbin rule. Sorry, Mom, this cash is for the temple.
Yeshua calls them hypocrites. But here's the kicker. The concept that you can dissolve a vow, that a rabbi can say, okay, given the circumstances, this vow is void so you can feed your mom, that is purely oral law. It's not in the written Bible.
So by yelling at them to dissolve the vows.
He's demanding they use the oral law correctly.
Yeah.
He's siding with the school of Hillel, who were more lenient against the school of Shammai, who were more rigid. It's an internal family dispute.
Okay, I'm following you. Yeshua is a Jewish rabbi participating in a Jewish debate about how to best keep the law. He's team law.
He is team law.
So then enter Paul, the hacker.
Enter Paul. And Paul doesn't say, let's interpret the law this way. Paul writes things like the law is a curse. He writes, Christ is the end of the law.
That's not a debate about speed limits anymore. That's slashing the tires.
It is a complete break. The source argues that Paul introduces a doctrine that Yeshua never taught. Faith, not works. I mean, Yeshua says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Paul says, if you have faith, you are saved apart from works.
But wait, this brings us to the elephant in the room. The most famous verse in history. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that whoever believes in him should not perish. Believes. It's right there. That sounds like Paul's theology to me. It doesn't say whoever does good works. It says whoever believes. Doesn't that prove Paul was right?
It depends entirely on what you think the word believe means. And the source argues that we have been reading that word through Paul's glasses, not John's.
Okay, take off the glasses. What does the word actually mean?
The Greek word is pistos. And to understand it, the source points us to the end of that same chapter, John 3:36. It's a Rosetta Stone moment.
What happens in verse 36?
The text sets up a contrast. It says, the one who pistos has eternal life, but the one who apiston will not see life.
Apithon. That sounds ominous. What does that translate to?
Most translations render it as disobeys.
Disobeys.
So let's use basic logic here. If I say the one who eats gets full, but the one who starves stays hungry, the word starves helps me define eats.
Right, they're antonyms.
So if the opposite of the word in question is disobeying, then the word itself cannot just mean intellectual agreement. You can intellectually agree with a speed limit while you're speeding.
True. I do that every morning.
If the antonym is disobey, the synonym must be something like obey or allegiance.
So the source suggests the translation should be, whoever obeys him shall not perish.
That is the argument. Whoever grants him allegiance, whoever follows his instruction.
Wow. That fundamentally changes the deal. It shifts the whole religion from, I feel a certain way about Jesus, to, I do what Jesus said.
And remember, what he said was to uphold the law. So the source claims that John 3:60 isn't a faith alone proof text. It's actually a faithfulness text that has been, in their view, mistranslated to fit Paul's theology.
Okay, this is a lot to process, but I have to push back again. If the New Testament is a war zone, why didn't the other apostles stop him? I mean, I seem to remember Peter writing a letter where he specifically calls Paul a beloved brother.
Ah, yes.
That doesn't sound like a civil war. That sounds like an endorsement.
60 Peter chapter 3. The smoking gun for the defense. Our beloved brother Paul. It's often used to shut down any argument about conflict. But the source takes a magnifying glass to this paragraph, and what they find is, well, it's fascinating.
Is it a fake? I know people argue about who wrote Peter's letters.
The source acknowledges that Peter likely didn't write it himself. It's probably from his circle. But even taking it at face value, the endorsement is incredibly shady. It's the classic damning with faint praise.
How so?
Peter writes that Paul speaks according to the wisdom given to him.
That sounds nice.
Does it? In a biblical context. He doesn't say Paul writes according to the Spirit. He doesn't say it's God-breathed or prophetic. He says it's according to the wisdom he has. It implies human limitation. It's like saying, well, he's doing the best he can with what he knows.
Ouch. That's a polite way of saying he's not one of us.
And then it gets darker. Peter immediately follows that by saying Paul's letters are hard to understand and that untaught and unstable people twist them to their own destruction.
Twist them.
The text says the result of this twisting is lawlessness.
There's that word again.
Peter is essentially putting a warning label on Paul's forehead. He's saying, look, this guy claims to be on our team, but his writing is so confusing that people use it as an excuse to sin and abandon the Torah. Be very careful.
That's a totally different vibe. It's not read Paul, he's great. It's read Paul at your own risk.
Exactly. And you have to remember the logistics. Peter is in Jerusalem. Paul is running around the Mediterranean. Peter doesn't have a copy of Galatians or Romans. He only knows what Paul tells him to his face. And in the book of Acts, every time Paul goes to Jerusalem, what does he do?
He says, I'm a good Jew. I keep the law. He even shaves his head and goes to the temple to prove it.
Right. So Peter's operating on limited intel. He sees the result of Paul's teaching people abandoning the law, and he warns against that. But he might not realize fully that Paul is the one actively teaching it in his letters.
So it's a slow motion collision. Peter suspects something is wrong, but he's trying to be diplomatic.
Until the end. The source argues that the diplomacy eventually collapsed. There's a moment where the conflict goes nuclear.
When does that happen?
It centers on the province of Asia, specifically the city of Ephesus.
Okay, paint the picture for us.
We have to jump to the very end of Paul's life. He's in prison. He writes his final letter to Timothy, and he sounds broken. He writes, "You know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me."
Everyone in Asia. That's a massive claim. That's not just a few people quitting the church choir. That's a whole region.
It is. Ephesus was the capital of Asia. Paul spent years there, and at the end of his life, he admits they have all turned their backs on him. Now, fast forward to the book of Revelation.
Okay.
Revelation starts with letters from Yeshua to 7 churches. Who was the first one?
Ephesus.
And what does Yeshua say to the church in Ephesus? Does he scold them for deserting his beloved servant Paul?
I'm guessing, yeah.
He commends them. He says, I know your deeds, and that you have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and you have found them to be liars.
Whoa. Connect those dots for me. Paul says, Asia deserted me. Revelation says, good job, Ephesus, for rejecting false apostles.
The source argues this isn't a coincidence. The false apostles they rejected were Paul and his associates. And the source provides a specific piece of forensic evidence to prove it. The smoking gun of the heresy.
What's the smoking gun?
Meat sacrificed to idols.
The BBQ question. We've talked about this.
It was the hot-button issue of the day. In 1 Corinthians, Paul spends chapters arguing that it's not a big deal. An idol is nothing. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market. He gives permission.
Right. Just don't offend your neighbor, but otherwise enjoy the burger.
Now look at Revelation 2. In that same letter to the churches, Yeshua specifically condemns a group for teaching God's servants to eat food sacrificed to idols. He calls it the teaching of Balaam. It is listed as a damnable heresy.
So you have a direct head-to-head clash. Paul says it's okay. Revelation says it's a sin. And the church that rejected the false apostles is the same one Paul complains about losing.
Precisely. The source argues that books like Revelation, Jude, and James aren't just generic letters. They are anti-Paul polemics. They were written to clean up the mess, the lawlessness that Paul's theology had created in the early communities.
This implies that the New Testament ends with the original apostles trying to excommunicate Paul's memory.
It implies that the house of Christianity is built on a fault line. The source describes Christian theology as a house built on sand, because it relies almost entirely on Paul's testimony about himself.
That's the hacker again.
Right. We believe Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus because Paul said so. We believe Paul was an apostle because Paul said so. But the source argues that once you remove Paul's self-affirmation and look at what the other texts, Matthew, James, Revelation, actually say, they don't support him. They are fighting him.
It's a stunning reframing. It turns the Bible from a monologue into a courtroom drama where the verdict is still out.
And it brings us back to that first question about believing versus obeying.
Yeah, that's the one that's going to stick with me.
If the source is correct, if Yeshua was a Torah-observant teacher who demanded obedience to the law and believing in him meant walking as he walked, then what does that mean for the definition of a believer today?
Are we using the same word but speaking a completely different language than the man on the cross?
That is the uncomfortable question the source leaves us with. It challenges the listener to read the text again, but this time, pay attention to the argument happening between the lines.
Well, I have a feeling a lot of listeners are going to be dusting off their Bibles after this one. Or maybe throwing them across the room. Either way, it's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely. The text is always more alive than we give it credit for.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you on the next one.
Keep asking questions.